They cannot get in anymore. This is not a strategy you adopted. It is not a wall you built in anger or in grief. Something shifted quietly, without announcement, and the entry points they once used no longer exist. You did not seal them deliberately. You recognize this. The access simply ended. What they call your resistance is not resistance, it is the absence of the old readiness. The part of you that used to open the door at the first sound of footsteps is no longer stationed there. It left without ceremony. This is what makes it so difficult for them to name manipulation, and I want you to hear this carefully. Manipulation does not require a villain. It requires a gap, a small space of uncertainty between what you feel and what you trust yourself to feel. A flicker of doubt about your own perception, your own memory, your own account of events. What those who could not face their own shadow required from you was not your compliance in any crude sense. They required your uncertainty. They needed you to stand close enough to the edge of your own perception that one well-placed word, one withdrawn look, one reframing of what you had witnessed with your own eyes could tip you, and for a long time, they had it. You were tippable, not because you were weak, because you were genuinely open, because you had not yet learned to distinguish between what you felt and what you were told you were feeling. That distinction is now fixed. I have observed this movement in many people who came to me exhausted and confused. They had lived for years inside relationships that required them to distrust their own interiority, not through overt force, through something far subtler, a persistent, low-level suggestion that what they experienced was an exaggeration, a misinterpretation, a product of their own sensitivity. The one who cannot face their own shadow does not announce what they are doing. They do not scheme openly. They locate a person whose readiness to question themselves is already high, and they establish residence in that gap. The empath, precisely because of the deep interiority that makes them perceptive, was often the perfect host for this kind of residence. But something happens when that interiority stops being a question and becomes a fact. I want to be precise here. What changed in you was not that you became harder. It was not that you grew a cynicism that protects through refusal. The people who reach me after years of painful relational labor are not, when they finally arrive at this point, cynical. They are very much still capable of feeling. In many cases, they feel more clearly than they ever have. What changed was the presence of a ground, an internal ground that no longer shifts when pressure is applied to it. When someone attempts to reframe your experience, and I mean to use the word attempts deliberately, because the attempt is still made, it no longer reaches what it once reached. The attempt lands, you register it, and it dissolves against something in you that is no longer in doubt. This is, psychologically speaking, not a product of willpower. Willpower is still a form of effort, and effort implies that something could go the other way if the effort failed. What I am describing is not effortful, it is structural. The structure of your perception of yourself has changed. What once required you to fight, to argue back, to prove your account of events, to defend your interiority against revision, now requires nothing at all. You are not fighting, you are simply present, and that presence carries a weight that certain kinds of pressure cannot penetrate, it is worth spending time here on what it means for a person to become structurally inaccessible to manipulation, because this is a psychological event. The title is pointing toward not a technique, not an achievement, but a transformation that completed largely without your knowledge while you were living through something else entirely. In my work on the development of personality, I observed repeatedly what I will call the provisional self, the self that adapts, the self that learns from very early on, that survival in a particular relational environment requires a careful monitoring of how one is perceived. Children who grow up in families where their interior states were routinely reinterpreted, where crying was called manipulation, where anger was called ingratitude, where perception was called imagination, these children develop an extraordinary capacity to see themselves through another's eyes. They become fluent in a language that is not their own, and they carry that fluency into adult life as though it were a gift. It is, in some ways, a gift. It created your perception, it made you sensitive, but it also installed in you a default assumption that your own account of your interior life was provisional, subject to correction, requiring external verification. The person who requires your uncertainty, the one who carries their shadow outward and needs someone to hold, it senses this immediately. Not consciously, the unconscious locates its counterpart, what you possessed, that quality of self-doubt, dressed as openness, was precisely the gap they needed, and for a time, the transaction was invisible to you because it felt, on the surface, like intimacy, like being known, like finally being seen by someone who understood how complex you were. It took time, sometimes years, to understand that what you were experiencing as being seen was, in fact, being read. There is a difference. Being seen implies that what was found was honored. Being read implies that what was found was used. The mirror reveals nothing it did not already contain. The one who cannot face their own shadow holds up the mirror of the other's permeability and calls it connection. When I think about the moment this changes, when I try to locate it clinically in the patients who came to me after this shift had begun, what I find is not a decision. I find a fatigue so complete that the monitoring stopped, not dramatically, not as a rebellion. The vigilance simply ran out of energy to maintain itself, and in the silence that followed, something that had always been present but always been overridden, a quieter, steadier register of self-knowledge became audible. The wall, this is the image that comes to me, and I want you to sit with it. Not a wall built outward, stone by stone, in anticipation of attack, a wall that was always there, part of the original structure of who you are, that had simply been covered, plastered over with the assumption that you needed to be more permeable than you were. When the plaster fell away, what remained was not new. What remained was what had been there before the adaptation began. This is why those who could no longer use your uncertainty are so disturbed by what you have become. They did not encounter a wall you erected against them specifically. They encountered a wall that was never not there. And there is a particular kind of disorientation in discovering that what you believed was openness in another person was all along a constructed surface, that underneath that surface was a structure that was never actually accessible to you. What they named as your coldness, your distance to your sudden change, what they call your hardness now is not new in you. It is old. It is what was there before they arrived. You are not harder. The provisional layer has dissolved. This is not temporary. The one who cannot face their own shadow does not lose you quietly. This is something I want to name carefully, because the noise of it can be disorienting. When the gap closes, when the uncertainty that was your most exploitable interior feature finally consolidates into ground, those who depended on that gap do not simply walk away. They escalate, they attempt the old entry point with greater force. They reframe the same event from three different angles in the same conversation. Watching to see which angle finally catches, they appeal to guilt, then to logic, then to your history together, then to what others would think, then to your reputation for sensitivity, as though your sensitivity itself were a vulnerability to be leveraged. What they are doing is not calculated in the ordinary sense, it is desperate. The unconscious is simply repeating what once worked, applying more pressure where before a lighter touch sufficed. And you notice it now, not as an attack you must defend against, as a pattern, a predictable sequence of attempts. The guilt appeal lands first and you feel it. I want to be clear, you still feel it, but you also feel, beneath the guilt, a kind of stillness, a part of you that is watching the arrival of the guilt the way you might watch weather through a window. Something is coming in, you register it, the window holds. This is the psychological structure of what I will call immunity through integration. Not immunity in the sense of numbness. In my work, I have always resisted the idea that psychological health looks like the absence of feeling. It does not. The person who feels nothing has not achieved freedom, they have achieved a different kind of imprisonment. What I observed in those who had genuinely passed through this threshold was an increase in feeling clarity, alongside a decrease in feeling reactivity. They felt more precisely, they were moved less randomly. An emotion arrived, recognizable, nameable, and it was held, examined, given its appropriate weight, and then placed down. It did not take over, it did not become the entire room. The one who projects their shadow onto you requires, above all else, that your emotions become the entire room, because when your room is flooded, when guilt has activated, when shame has entered, when you are defending yourself against a version of events you know to be false but cannot seem to defeat with language in that flooding, you become manageable. Your resources are occupied, you cannot perceive clearly, and whatever direction they point you in during that flood, you will move, because you are trying to get out of the water. What ended was the flooding, not the feeling. The flooding, the distinction is essential, and I want to hold it here for a moment before we go further. Feeling is information. I have said this throughout my work in various forms. and it is one of the few things I would repeat without hesitation across the whole of my career. When you feel guilt, guilt is pointing at something. When you feel grief, grief is pointing at something. When you feel anger, and the anger of the empath is a subject I want to return to in some depth. Anger is pointing at something that was violated. Feeling is the psyche's primary language. You do not defeat the shadow by silencing the language, you defeat it by learning, finally, to translate. The flooding is what happens when that language is no longer being translated. When feeling arrives, and instead of being heard, it is simply experienced as an overwhelming event from which you must escape by any means available. The escape route that manipulation offers is simple. Follow the version of reality I am presenting to you, and the flooding will stop. Accept my reframing, accept my account, agree that what you felt was an exaggeration. Step back from what you know and step into what I am offering, and the pressure will ease. You step back many times. I am not naming this as weakness. I am naming it as what it was, a reasonable response to an intolerable internal state. When the nervous system is in flood, any exit is compelling, but somewhere in the repetition of this, somewhere in the accumulated weight of all the times you stepped back, then stepped back again, then stepped back a third time and noticed that the promised relief never actually arrived, something began to change in you. Not a decision, en accumulation. The psyche keeps its own ledger. You may not have been counting, but the ledger was, and at some point the ledger reached a figure that the conscious mind could no longer ignore. I want to take you now into the territory of what I observed clinically about this threshold, because it is not, as most people expect, dramatic. It does not arrive as a revelation. It does not announce itself. What I observed again and again in the consulting room was that the change had already happened by the time the person could speak of it. They came to me saying something is different. I don't know when it changed. I cannot find a moment, and that is correct. There was no moment. There was a weight that eventually exceeded the structure that had been holding it, and the structure shifted. I once treated a woman who came to me after the end of a relationship of many years, a relationship that had, from the outside, all the markers of closeness. She was not in dramatic distress. She was puzzled. She said to me, he told me near the end, that I had become unreachable, that I used to be warm and now I was cold. And she could not fully contradict this. She agreed that something in her had become. She paused before the word quieter. She did not experience it as coldness. She experienced it as a kind of settling, but she did not know when the settling had happened or what had caused it. We worked together for several months before a dream she brought into the consulting room gave us the language we needed. She dreamed repeatedly. This dream came to her 4 or 5 times across a period of 8 weeks that she was standing in the house she had grown up in. The house was structurally unchanged. Same walls, same light through the kitchen window in the afternoon. But the furniture was gone, not removed. She had the clear impression in the dream that the furniture had simply absorbed into the walls, as though the house had taken it back. She was standing in the center of the main room, and she could hear, somewhere in the structure of the house itself. A voice, not her mother's voice, not anyone she could identify, a voice that seemed to belong to the house the way wood grain belongs to a door. It was speaking her name, slowly, without urgency. She did not feel frightened. She felt that the house already knew something about her that she had only recently begun to suspect. She told me, when she finally put words to the dream, it was as though the house had stopped pretending to need the furniture, as though it had always been able to stand without it. The furniture, she came to understand, was the accommodation, all the small and large adjustments she had made to her own interior design to make herself navigable to others, to make herself a place where someone else could set down what they could not carry themselves. The dream was not telling her something new. The dream was confirming something that had already completed. The house had already returned to itself. She was simply walking through it for the first time without the old arrangement in place. This is what the end of permeability looks like from the inside. Not hardness, not closure, a return to a structure that was always yours, with the accommodations finally removed, the voice in the walls. And I want to carry this forward because it is important, was not outside her. It was not another person calling. It was the house itself naming her. The psyche, having released the accommodating furniture, had become audible to itself in a way it had not been before. What she had experienced in waking life as the other person's claim that she had become cold was, in the register of the dream, the opposite. The house had become more itself, more genuinely inhabited, not less. This is the distinction that those who could no longer access her could not perceive from outside. A house with no furniture looks empty. From inside, it looks, for the first time, like yours. The shadow at the center of this, and there is always a shadow component when we speak of the empath's immunity, is the anger she had not yet been permitted to feel, not anger at him specifically, anger at the years of rearrangement, anger at the sheer quantity of interior space she had given over to making herself legible to someone whose primary investment was in keeping her uncertain. This anger had not been processed. It had been sitting very patiently beneath the accommodation, and the dream was also in its quieter register, telling her that the anger was part of the structure, that it belonged in the walls. The anger of the empath is one of the most misunderstood psychological phenomena I encountered across my entire career. I want to spend considerable time here because what is typically done with this anger by the person carrying it and by those around them is almost always wrong. And the consequences of that wrongness are significant. Let me begin with what the anger is not. It is not a symptom of failed healing. It is not evidence that something in you remains unresolved in the way that requires correction. It is not the shadow emerging to sabotage progress. I have heard this interpretation offered, sometimes by well-meaning people, sometimes by those who had a vested interest in keeping the anger contained, and it is, in every case, a misreading of what the psyche is doing. The anger that arrives in the person who has passed through the threshold I have been describing is not pathological. It is informational. It is the psyche completing an account that was left open when a rite of the shadow and I have written of it at length in many forms. Across many decades, I am writing about the repository of everything the conscious personality could not afford to carry in plain sight. The self that adapts, that learns to be perceptive and accommodating and emotionally available, learns also to place certain experiences in the shadow, not through conscious decision, through the slow pressure of relational survival. The child who discovers early that their anger makes the environment more dangerous does not decide to hide the anger. The anger moves itself. It becomes shadow because the conditions of the environment made shadow the only viable location for it. And there it waits. This is the thing that the people who simplified the shadow misunderstood. The shadow is not a storage facility where material is placed and forgotten. The shadow is active. It exerts pressure. It organizes behavior from below the floor of consciousness. The empath who cannot feel their own anger does not experience its absence. They experience its displacement. It surfaces as guilt, as chronic over-responsibility, as the persistent conviction that whatever is wrong in a relationship is somehow the product of their own insufficient effort, as the inability to leave a situation that is clearly, in the language of the body, wrong. The anger was always there. It was doing work the whole time. It was keeping the system running through redirection, through sublimation, through the conversion of its energy into a kind of tireless relational labor. What changed when the permeability ended was not that the anger was finally felt for the first time. It was that the anger was finally felt as anger, named correctly, located correctly, given its right subject and its right object. This is what I mean by integration, not the resolution of the anger into something more palatable, not the transformation of anger into forgiveness as a therapeutic endpoint. Integration means the anger is allowed to take its true form and its true position inside the psychic structure. And when it does, when the anger is no longer doing the work of guilt, no longer expressing itself as compulsive caretaking, no longer surfacing as inexplicable grief, it becomes something that those who have not passed through this threshold find very difficult to describe from outside. They call it coldness. They call it distance. They call it that you have changed, that you are not yourself, that they don't recognize you anymore. And there is, in a very precise sense, truth in that what they are encountering is not the self that was managed into permeability. What they are encountering is the anger that has been integrated into the structure of the self, and integrated anger does not perform, it does not make speeches, it does not demand recognition, it simply holds its ground. It is in the register of ordinary social interaction, almost invisible, except to those who require you to be without it. To those people, it is unmistakable. They sense it the way you sense a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, not as hostility, as the absolute absence of the compliance they depended on. The mirror no longer returns what they brought to it. I want to move now into the specific mechanism by which the awakened interior becomes structurally resistant to what I will carefully name, following the psychological logic rather than the clinical vocabulary, the projective operation. because this is the heart of what the title is pointing toward. Not a general immunity to difficulty, not a vague strengthening of character, a specific structural change that makes a very particular relational operation no longer viable. The projective operation works as follows. The one who cannot face their own shadow, the one who has accumulated a significant quantity of self-material that is intolerable to consciousness, requires an external location for that material. They do not construct this requirement deliberately. The unconscious constructs it. What they need is a person who will receive the projection, who will, through the quality of their own openness, their own self-questioning, their own habituated uncertainty, take on the shape of what is being projected, become the container, become the one who carries what cannot be borne internally. I wrote of this in my work on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a clinical observation repeated so frequently, it had the quality of law. The projector is not looking for anyone. They are looking for a specific texture of receptivity, and the person who has been trained since early life to receive, to absorb, to hold, to translate another's interior states as though they were their own is, in the ordinary social world, invisible as a target. They appear simply to be sensitive, warm, available. The projection moves into that availability, the way water moves into a depression in the ground. It does not decide to go there. Topography determines it, what changes when the ground levels, and this is the precise image I want you to hold. Not a wall, not an erected defense, a leveling. The depression in the ground that once determined where the water would flow has filled in, not with stone, with the returned material, with the shadow that was integrated, with the anger that found its right form, with the grief that was processed instead of performed, with all of the interior material that, when it was in the wrong location, created exactly the topography that the projective operation required. The fill ground is smooth, the water arrives and moves on. There is nowhere for it to pool. This is why you cannot be easily manipulated now. Not because you became suspicious, not because you erected a vigilance that watches for incoming attempts and deflects them. Vigilance is exhausting and eventually fails. What you have is not vigilance. You have interior density, the material that was missing, that was located outside you in the form of projected content you unconsciously accepted as your own, has returned to its source. You are more complete than you were, and completion, in this very specific sense, means there is less empty space available for foreign material to occupy. The window has always been there in this house. This is something I want to say carefully, because the language of immunity can imply a closing off that misrepresents what actually occurred. You have not sealed yourself. You are not less permeable in the sense of being less perceptive. In many ways, the perception is finer now than it was before, because it is no longer muddied by the occupation of material that did not belong to you. The signal is cleaner. You feel what is yours more clearly because you are no longer simultaneously processing what was placed in you by someone else's unconscious need. What you lost was the noise, and in the silence left by the noise, something that had always been there, a quality of inner authority, a ground-level certainty about your own experience became the primary register of your interior life. This is the psychological event that those who once depended on your noise cannot recover from. They required the noise. They required you to be uncertain enough, reactive enough, doubt-filled enough that their version of events could find purchase in the silence. Their version has nothing to hold on to. I want to speak now about what happens to the relational field when this shift completes, because it does not only affect the people who required your permeability, it reorganizes the entire field. People who were neutral toward you, who neither used you nor particularly saw you, begin to respond differently. There is something in the settled presence that registers even to those who have no investment in destabilizing it. It reads from outside as authority, not the authority of title or role, the authority of a person who is occupying their interior space without apology or negotiation. This is, in the Jungian register, what I would call the authority of the individuating self. The self that has stopped performing its adapted version and has begun awkwardly at first, then with increasing steadiness to simply be what it is, not demonstratively, not as a statement directed at anyone, as a fact. The way a tree is a fact, the tree does not announce that it is no longer the sapling it once was. It simply has a different relationship to the wind. The spine holds differently now. You may have noticed this in the body, a quality of physical settledness that was not there before. The body, which spent years in the low-level vigilance of the highly perceptive person navigating environments that required constant self-monitoring, has begun to release the posture of readiness, not all at once, in increments, but the direction is unmistakable. The body, like the psyche, is returning to a structure it always contained but rarely inhabited fully. This is the ground from which the immunity grows. Not a decision, not an achievement, a return. There is one more thing I want to name before we arrive at what has completed. It concerns the people who were not trying to use you, the ones who came to you genuinely, who were drawn to your perception, your steadiness, your capacity to hold complexity without flinching, and who find now that what they are meeting is different from what they knew, not worse, different, and the difference unsettles them in a way they cannot fully articulate. They will say things like, "You seem far away," or "I can't tell what you're thinking anymore," or, most revealingly, "You used to be easier to talk to." And there is something in that last phrase that deserves careful attention. Easier. What they mean, without knowing they mean it, is that you used to be more responsive to their emotional cues, more available for the relational choreography that intimacy, in its conventional form, often requires: the quick reassurance, the immediate mirroring, the way a sensitive person, trained to perceive and respond, creates in others the sensation of being deeply met. You still meet people, but the meeting now happens on different terms. What changed is the automaticity, the response that used to arrive before you had finished registering the stimulus, the comfort offered before you had determined whether comfort was what the situation required. The agreement extended before you had compared it against your own position. That automaticity has slowed, not stopped, slowed. There is now a pause between perception and response that was not there before. In that pause, something that I would call discernment has room to operate. You feel what the other person is bringing, you consider it, you determine what in you, if anything, genuinely meets it, and then you respond from that determination rather than from the old trained reflex. This pause is for people who were accustomed to the reflex, disorienting. The reflex made them feel safe. It meant you were reliably available in a particular way. The pause introduces uncertainty. They cannot predict, as they once could, exactly how you will respond, and for those whose relationship with you was built, partly or wholly, on the predictability of your accommodation, this uncertainty is experienced as loss, sometimes as abandonment, sometimes as betrayal, as though the you that is now present is a diminished version of the you they knew, as though something was taken from you, and they are grieving what remains. But you know, and this is the knowledge that the threshold confers, that what they are grieving is not your diminishment. They are grieving the accommodation, they are grieving the furniture, and the furniture was never the house. I want to speak now about something I observed in my own interior life during the years when I was working through what I can only describe as the integration of my own projected material, because I think it would be dishonest to speak of this transformation as though I observed it only in others. I came to understand through my own passage, through it, that the immunity I am describing is not a comfortable state to inhabit, at least not at first. There is a period, it can last months, sometimes longer, during which the settled ground feels less like arrival and more like exposure. You are no longer protected by the noise of the old system. The relational choreography that kept you busy, kept your attention occupied, kept you in constant motion between other people's needs, that choreography has ended, and in its absence there is a quality of spaciousness that can, before it is inhabited, feel like emptiness. This is the moment when many people attempt to rebuild the accommodation, not consciously. The psyche, left with unstructured space it does not yet know how to occupy, reaches for the familiar architecture, begins to soften the ground again, begins to reintroduce the small permeabilities, a concession here, a self-doubt reactivated there, not because those things are true, but because they are known. The known, even when it was painful, has the comfort of familiarity. The open ground has no such comfort. What carries a person through this period is not resolve. Resolve runs out. What carries them through is the body's memory of what the flooding felt like, not as a thought, as a physical fact. The body remembers the exhaustion of constant absorption. The nervous system retains the signature of years spent in states of low-level alert, and when the new openness, the emptiness that is actually space, begins to press toward the old accommodation, the body offers its testimony quietly, without drama, a simple physical, knowing that the direction of the old architecture is a direction the organism will not sustain again. The body, in this way, becomes the ally of the individuating psyche, not the body as metaphor, the body as witness, The body that spent years translating other people's unconscious material into its own tissue, into tension, into insomnia, into the chronic, low-grade fatigue that the empath often carries as a background condition of their existence. This body now recognizes, at the level of sensation, the difference between contact that costs and contact that does not, and it begins quietly to organize the self around that recognition. I once treated a man who came to me 3 years after what he described as the collapse of a relationship that had defined his adult life. He was not bitter, he was, if anything, too calm. A calm I recognized as the calm of someone who had arrived somewhere they did not yet have language for. He told me that he had spent the first year after the end of that relationship waiting to feel something he could name, that the grief he expected had not arrived in the form he anticipated. What arrived instead was a recurring dream. He dreamed that he was standing in a long hallway. The hallway was his own. He recognized it as belonging to the interior of himself, in the way one recognizes things in dreams without requiring explanation. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door, and through the door came a quality of light he could not name, not warm, not cold, simply present, the way light is present before you decide what to do with it. He would begin walking toward the door. Each time he walked toward it, he became aware that someone was behind him, not following him, standing at the entrance to the hallway, watching him walk away. He could feel the quality of their attention on his back. It was not hostile, it was the attention of someone who had expected him to turn around and had not yet accepted that he would not. He told me that in the dream he never turned. He continued walking toward the light. He did not reach the door in any of the dreams. The walking continued and the door remained at the same distance. But he said that what he felt as he walked, with the watching presence behind him and the unreached door ahead, was not frustration. It was something he could only call rightness, as though the walking itself, not the arriving, was the thing that had been missing for a very long time. I sat with that dream for a long time after he brought it to me, because what it named with a precision that language in its ordinary form struggles to achieve was the exact quality of the post-threshold state. The one behind him was not an enemy, was not a villain, was the accumulated weight of the relational system he had finally stopped turning back for, and the door unreached, present, casting its unnamed light, was not a promise. It was simply the direction that belonged to him, the direction that had always been there. Behind all the turning back, the hallway was his. The walking was already the thing. What I want to say now, in closing, is something that requires the most precision I can bring to it, because it is easy, when speaking of this transformation, to drift toward a language of arrival, as though what I have been describing is the conclusion of a journey, a destination reached, a permanent state achieved. That language would be wrong. The psyche does not achieve permanent states. It moves, it continues. What has completed is not the process. What has completed is a particular configuration of the self, the configuration organized around the necessity of your own permeability, around the structural requirement that you remain uncertain enough to be used. That configuration is gone. Its logic has been seen through. The one who required your collapse in order to avoid their own has lost the purchase they once had, not because you became stronger in the simple sense, because the specific weakness their operation required is no longer structurally available. The projection required a gap. The gap has closed. You are still permeable to what is genuinely yours, to grief that belongs to you, to love that moves through you without colonizing you, to the perception that was always your most precise instrument. None of that has been sealed. What has been sealed is the channel that was never meant to carry what it was made to carry for so long. The wall in this house was never against the world. It was simply the wall that kept the house standing. What the projection required of you has been withdrawn. It will not find its way back in.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.